Good morning, North. I have been assigned to read Chapter 2, The Case of the Missing Misses. I'm going to front load you real quick on a couple questions that you're going to have to answer after you hear the chapter. Question number 1, who was absent on day number 2 of the book that made everyone in the class very nervous? Question number 2, what is the actual principal's name? And why was he in the class? Question 3, how did Mr. E, which you don't know who it is yet, the substitute teacher, get to know the kids? So how do they get the relationships being built? Question number 4, what is the first thing that Mr. E pulled out of his bag? He has the actual big bag he brings into the class. And what was the first subject that they learned and worked on in class? And number 5, who had an issue or a problem with the Mathketball game that they were playing and why? All right, Chapter 2. I'm always excited for the start of a new day in room 26. But the next morning, I could hardly wait to hear Miss Brisbane read more about Sherlock Holmes. I waited for the key to turn in the door and for Mrs. Brisbane to bustle into the classroom. I waited for the bell to ring and for my friends to arrive, the children in the class. I waited and waited and waited some more. In fact, I waited so long the bell rang, but nobody came in. I knew it wasn't Saturday. I never spend Saturdays at school because I go home with one of my classmates on the weekends. Sometimes I go home with Miss Brisbane. Either way, I have a hamsterific good time. OG, who's the frog, usually stays in room 26 on the weekends, which must be lonely for him, poor frog. OG, something's wrong, I squeaked loudly to my neighbor. Boing, 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 he replied. He sounded as worried as I was. I could see some of my friends' faces looking through the window in the door. Some of the classmates were kind of peeking in. Humphrey, let us in, I heard Simon's muffled voice calling. It was the only time in my life I wish I wasn't a hamster so I could be big enough to open the door. Long after the bell rang, I finally heard some jiggling and joggling and the door swung open at last. But Miss Brisbane wasn't the human opening the door. It was our principal, Mr. Morales. That's one of my questions. Behind him were my fellow students. Come on in, boys and girls, he said. Mr. Morales is the most important person at Longfellow School because he's in charge of everything. He was wearing a tie with tiny little question marks all over it. He has lots of interesting ties. Kind of sounds like Mr. Thomas. Take your seats, he said. My fellow students were worried too. I could tell because they were quieter than usual. I guess that was a clue. It looks as if Miss Brisbane is going to be late, he said. We're trying to reach her now. Miss Brisbane is never, never, never late. This was a very pea-whacking morning. I'll take attendance, Mr. Morales said. Holly jumped up and offered to help. Thank you, he said to her, but I think I can handle it. Then he called out the names, and each student answered present in return. Everyone was present except Miss Brisbane. Mr. Morales looked uneasy. So what do you usually do first in the morning? Helpful Holly raised her hand. We had homework last night, she said. I can collect it. Thank you, Mr. Morales said. Holly went up and down the aisles collecting the homework. How I wish I could get a look at those 5 mystery questions from last night. Everybody turned in a homework sheet except for one person, forgetful Phenab, or I can't say the word, foam. When Holly passed by her table, she blushed and said, "Oh no, I forgot it. I'll bring it tomorrow." As helpful as Holly is, she sometimes gets carried away. That's when I call her too helpful Holly. She frowned and said, "You were supposed to bring it today." Mr. Morales stepped forward. "It's okay, Holly. We'll straighten things out when Miss Brisbane gets here," he said. Phew, I was glad to hear him say that Miss Brisbane was coming. Just then, the phone in the classroom rang. Mr. Morales said, "Oh," and then, "I see," and finally, "Very well," while my classmates were completely quiet. Mr. Morales hung up the phone. Boys and girls, Miss Brisbane won't be here today, he said. A substitute is on the way to take care of the class. The last time I had a substitute teacher was Miss Mack was here. but I didn't know she was a substitute because I didn't know much about the school when I first arrived. I certainly learned a lot since then. Mr. Alice seemed a little confused about what to do next, and he kept looking at his watch. Read to us from the red-headed league, I squeaked loudly. My classmates all giggled when they heard me. Mr. Alice walked over to my cage. "Oh, so you want to take over the class, Humphrey?" he said. I jumped on my wheel and spun it fast. "Maybe Humphrey thinks we should do some exercise," Mr. Alice said. That made my classmates giggle even more. Rosie made her wheelchair spin in a circle. "I love to spin too," she said, and everybody laughed. Just then the door of the classroom opened and a young man rushed into the room. The first thing I noticed about him was his red hair. I think Sherlock Holmes would have noticed that too. I also saw that he was wearing round glasses, and on his shirt was a big button with writing on it and said, "Give peas a chance." I love any veggies, including peas. So this human and I definitely had something in common. He had a big cloth bag slung over his shoulder, sort of like Santa Claus. It was lumpy and bumpy and way too big for a lunch bag. Mr. Morales stepped forward and shook his hand. "Welcome, I'm the principal," he said. "Mr. Morales." "Hi," the young man said. "I'm Ed Adenopoulos." The principal turned to the class and said, "Here's your substitute for the day. I expect you to give him your full attention." Mr. Morales left, and Mr. E gave us a friendly smile. "Hi, kids," he said. "I know Adenopoulos is a mouthful, so you can just call me Mr. E." There were a few giggles, and Slow Down Simon repeated the name out loud the way I had heard it. "Mystery." "Mr. E." Mr. E smiled and nodded. "Mystery. That's a good one. Hey, you know my name, but I don't know yours. I'm going to come around and up and down the aisles, and you can tell me who you are." He walked around the student tables one by one, asking, "What's your name?" He high-fived each student and something like, "Cool, sure," or "Glad to know you," or "Awesome." "My name is Holly, and I collected the homework this morning." "Too helpful," Holly said when Mr. E got to her. "It was our mysterious word sheet. I put it on the teacher's desk. Only one didn't get it turned in." "Oh, okay, thanks," he said. "I'm Sophie, and I really like to spin. I like your pin. I like to wear pins with sayings, too." Stop talking," Sophie said. "Do you remember where you got it?" Mr. E didn't answer when he got it. Didn't remember where he got it. Sophie kept on talking until he said, "I think I better give the rest of the class a chance." He moved on to the next table. "I'm Thomas T. True," Thomas said. "My dad's a detective like Sherlock Holmes." "Not," I heard Just Joey mutter. Mr. E turned toward the class. "What's the problem?" he asked. "He told me that his dad's an airplane pilot," Just Joey said. "So?" Thomas said. "He could be both. He told me that his dad's a ship captain," Small Paul grumbled. Mr. E just laughed. "Sounds like a very talented father." Then he moved on again. When he got to my side of the room, he finally noticed OG and me. "Whoa," he said. "These are some funny-looking students." I heard some giggles, but I wasn't laughing. I can see how you might call OG funny-looking, but not a handsome golden hamster like me. Mr. E leaned in and looked right at me. "What's its name?" "Humphrey," I squeaked loudly, "and I am not an it." "Whoa," he said. I think he's talking. "What is he, a rat?" It was clear that this teacher didn't do his homework when it came to animals. Imagine mistaking me for a rat. Luckily, my friends all shouted out, "Hamster!" His name is Humphrey," Holly added. Mr. E said, "Cool." Then he turned to OG. "I know this is a frog, right? What's his name?" he asked. "Boing, boing, boing, boing," OG twanged loudly. "He probably doesn't like being called an it either." "His name is OG, Rolling Rosie explained. "OG the frog," Mr. E said. "I like it." He was quiet for a few seconds, then he looked around the room. I was still sleeping when I got the call to come over here, so I don't know what your teacher's plans were today," he said. "Why don't you tell me what you want to do?" My friends looked surprised. I'm sure I looked surprised too. Hurry up, Harry waved his hand, and Mr. E called on him. "I'd like to go home," he said. Everybody laughed. It was a funny thing to say, but I don't think Mrs. Brisbane would have laughed. "I understand," Mr. E said, "but I don't think that's going to happen. Hey, I know. Why don't we sing a song to help me remember your names?" Everybody seemed to like the idea of a song. I was amazed at what happened next. Mr. E pointed at a student. Then the student stood up and said his name, and then the teacher made a little rhyming song with the name. He took parts of each name and added things to them like banana, fana, and fee, fi, fo. After a few names, the whole class joined in. The song made my friends giggle, but it was very confusing to me. After he'd finished the whole class, Rosie raised her hand and asked if I could do my name. I can't remember it all, but it ended with fee, fi, fo, Humphrey, Humphrey, Bumphrey, Mumphrey, Humphrey, whoa. How was this going to help remember our real names? OG's name sounded even stranger. Bog, Fog, Mog. I don't know what OG thought, but I was in a bit of a fog myself. I was still thinking about Mumphrey and Mog when the bell rang for recess. As soon as my classmates were gone, Mr. E picked up his big sack and looked inside. "Let's see," he mumbled. "What's next? Maybe this." Then he glanced over at OG and me and chuckled. "I don't know why I'm talking out loud when I know you can't understand me." OG piped up first. "Boing, boing. You are wrong, wrong, wrong," I squeaked, wishing with all my might that Mr. E could understand me. He didn't notice. He was too busy rummaging around in that big cloth sack. Suddenly he stopped and smiled. "Okay, I got it. I've got it." That's all he said. I thought I'd pretty well figured out humans in my time as a classroom hamster so far, but Mr. E was a real mystery to me. When my friends were back in their seats, Mr. E announced that it was time for math. Some of the students groaned until the teacher reached into his bag and pulled out a basketball. "We are going to play a game," he said. "It's called Mathketball." My friends, and that's one of the questions, my friends looked puzzled. I didn't blame them. "Of course, we could just have a math quiz," Mr. E said, "if you like." "No!" the students all yelled. "Mathketball, Mathketball." Mumphrey, Mog, Mathketball, all the mystery words. I was learning a whole new language today. First, Mr. E threw the ball to slow down Simon. "Quick, 4 plus 4. Simon caught the ball and said 8. "Great," Mr. E said, "but in Mathketball, instead of saying the answer, you bounce it." Simon looked confused for a second, and then he understood. He bounced the basketball 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. "That's it," Mr. E told him. "Now throw it back." The teacher caught the ball, and then he threw it to Be Careful Kelsey. 10 minus 5, he said. Kelsey bounced the ball 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. "Great," Mr. E said. "Now throw it back." Kelsey dropped the ball and bounced it back to the floor. "Careful," Mr. E said as he scooped it up. Just Joey caught the ball next. And when Mr. E said 12 plus 3, Joey bounced it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 times. I know because I counted. Then the ball went to Paul G. 6 plus 5, Mr. E said. Tall Paul bounced it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. Then he stopped. "One more time," I squeaked. I guessed he didn't hear me. Mr. E gave him another chance, which was nice, and Tall Paul got the problem right. As the game went on, the pace went faster and faster, and it got more exciting, and it also got louder and louder. And then the door to room 26 swung open. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Wright. You guys learned who she was yesterday. Mr. E looked pretty surprised when he saw her. Maybe he noticed her whistle. I certainly did. "Hello," he said. It was more of a question than a greeting. "You're the substitute for Mrs. Brisbane?" she asked. "Yep, I'm Mr. E," the substitute said. Miss Wright looked puzzled. "Mr. E?" she asked. "What's your name?" Mr. E laughed. "My name is Adamopoulos, but Mr. E is fine with me." Miss Wright frowned. I guess Mr. E wasn't fine with her. And you are, Mr. E asked. "Mrs. Wright, the PE teacher." To my great surprise, Mr. E laughed. "Mrs. Wright? I guess you're never wrong," making a little joke. Some of my classmates giggled, and Mrs. Wright wasn't the giggling type. She stepped in the classroom and looked around. Is that a basketball Is that basketball the property of Longfellow School? She asked. The substitute shook his head. Nope, I brought it from home. That didn't seem to please Mrs. Wright at all. You're probably not aware of the basketballs are only allowed outside on the playground. No ball playing in the classroom, she said, and the only official Longfellow School equipment is allowed. Really? Mr. E seemed surprised. Really, Mrs. Wright said. I'm the chairperson of the Committee of School Property. There are safety issues with having a ball in the classroom. And by the way, the noise level in the classroom is unacceptable. I could hear you all the way down the hall. We were doing math, Mr. E said. Right, class? My friends all nodded. Mrs. Wright fingered her whistle and braced herself for an unsqueakable loud noise. Luckily, none came. That's funny, she said. I thought you were playing basketball. Mr. E smiled and looked at my classmates. What were we playing? Mathketball, my friends all answered. Miss Wright frowned even more. If that's possible. Perhaps you can do more math quietly in the future, she said. And of course, I'm sure Miss Brisbane will be back tomorrow. I crossed my paws and hoped that she was right. Oh, how I hoped that she was right. Because school with Mr. E was making me very, very pewacked. That means confused. Good luck with chapter 3.